The old book here, Battle of the Blue Licks, by some author, some date. Samuel Wilson, Lexington, Kentucky, 1927. I only marked one thing, but they're talking about the Shawnees. For 40 years from the beginning of the French and Indian War in 1754. 1754 was the beginning of the French and Indian War. 1754 was also the year that Esquippaquiddick ceased to be the original Shawnee town in Clark County, Kentucky. So 1754 was the beginning of the French and Indian War, all the way to the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. So it's 41 years of warfare. So for 40 years, from the beginning to the end, the Shawnees were almost constantly at war with the English or Americans and distinguished themselves as the most hostile tribe in the Ohio Valley region. Most of the expeditions sent across the Ohio during the Revolutionary period were directed against the Shawnees, and most of the destruction on the Kentucky frontiers was the work of the same tribe. So-called Lake Indians consisted most of Ottawas and Chippewas, but included other Indians living on the border. Savage warfare is Captains McKee and Elliott and two brothers Simon and George McGurty. Above all, there's no lack of discipline. Well might the courageous Kentuckians of ties devoted, quailed, even blah blah blah. Okay. So Battle of Blue Licks, this is kind of actually a really racist book. Talks about how the Indians are savages that need to be destroyed. So it's hard to read. But it, I don't know. It's kind of like reading some of these Republican stuff. If they agree with you, then you know that at least, they agree with that. I don't know, free market economy. You had, the Chicago boys. Who was that? Milton Friedman. Even Milton Friedman says you need some government for the court system to have some dispute. You need some court system. He also said, I think, defense and some other reasons to have a court. But having a good court system is good for business, right? So that's why he was in favor of having a court system. So that's the, that's Logan's Lament, right? Captain Logan. So to recap, what I just talked about before was Byrd's invasion of Kentucky, also called Ruddle's Station Massacre. 20 people were massacred, and they actually talked about it in the horrible, the massacre was insane. This guy says that he's got information from his family, and it actually contradicts a lot of the historians' accounts. Here's what happened. So, Byrd's invasion. There had been a lot of rain that spring, and settlers were not expecting an attack from the north. They did get a warning of potential Indian trouble, and Monday, June 30th, 1780, gathered at Ruddle Station. Tuesday, some of the boys were sent across the creek to drive some stray cows into the stockade. Heavy rain had fallen the night before. The settlers thought it would delay an attack. Unfortunately, McKee and his Indians and cannon had landed at Falmouth, including Blue Jacket and Simon Girty. They landed in Falmouth and had arrived early that morning. The boys were making a lot of noise, and Joseph Conway was climbing up the opposite bank when he was shot and scalped. Even though Joseph Conway was shot and scalped, he didn't die. So he was shot, top of the head ripped off, he didn't die. The wound wasn't fatal, and after an hour or two, managed to crawl across the creek and into the stockade. The attack resumed at 1 when Byrd and the rest of the British and Indians arrived. The settlers defended themselves vigorously. After 2 shots from the cannon broke the fort walls in, it was clear they could not hold out. They were promised they would not be killed if they surrendered. They surrendered, and the Indians promptly set on them, tomahawking and scalping the old people and infants. Everything in the fort was stolen or destroyed by 4 p.m. The remainder of the captives were begun on a long walk to Detroit, among them the Conway family. This was the first Kentucky fort to surrender. The next morning, Joseph's scalped head was bleeding badly. A woman noticed and reached down into an old tree stump and got a handful of spider webs and matted them on the wound, which stopped the bleeding and saved the boy's life. Early Moved to Kentucky with his father. Samuel Conway's family settled in Ruddle Station. Henry Groff, one Persley, and others also resided there. About 200 Indians came and attacked the fort. Found one side of the fort unfinished, and the whites hastened and finished it, putting up pickets. That evening, the Indians made a violent attack, and whites returned the fire. None were injured in the fort, and none certain that they killed any Indians. The next morning, the Indians had retired, and the whites found many articles which they had dropped. The American Indians, the Native Americans, continued to hover around for a couple of weeks altogether, and then they retired. Joseph Conway and two others went out about a mile and a half reconnoitering when Conway was shot by a party of their Indians. Shit. Wounded on the left side and was caught and tomahawk, breaking his skull and scalped and left for dead. Oh, that's the same thing that had happened before. I thought it happened again. I was like, damn. The reports of the guns were heard at the fort, and a party went out and met the two fugitives returning, who reported that Conway was killed. They went on and brought in Conway, who was gradually recovering, when the Indians set to Detroit for reinforcements and cannon. 2 weeks after Conway was wounded, Colonel Byrd and party appeared with cannon. They first fired a cannon shot and missed. Then a second shot, which knocked out some of the corners of the blockhouse. And then the inmates concluded the British and Indians could take the place and listen to the terms. The British pledged protection to the prisoners and their property, and were not to be surrendered to the Indians, but no effort were made by the British to fulfill that pledge. Conway, with his head bandaged, was taken by an old Indian and a son, who were really kind to him. They also took an unmarried sister of Conway's, older than he was, who dressed his head before leaving Ruddles. One Indian tore off the bandage from Conway's head, but he was repelled by the old Indian and his son as interfering with their prisoner. They were taken direct to Detroit and turned over to the British there and remained there for 4 years. So, formative force, savage warfare. And wives are separated from their husbands, mothers from their children without hope of ever being reunited. The prisoners were secure and booty divided. The savages proposed to move against Martin Station in Bourbon County, but Colonel Byrd refused. Yeah, so that's the attack of Ruddle Station and Ruddle Station and Martin Station, 1780, before the Battle of Blue Licks. The Battle of Blue Licks, Hugh McGarry, the psychopath, from page 35 of A New History of Kentucky. Hugh McGarry was the reason why the Kentucky settlers, the white Americans, lost to the Native Americans. Hugh McGarry was the party that rushed outside to drive them off. Let's talk about the raids. There's a bunch of raids. March 7th, 1777, a male slave was killed. His master wounded as they worked in a field in Boonesboro. This is 1777. 1777, this is 5 years before the Battle of Blue Licks. So Battle of Blue Licks happens 5 years later. 5 years earlier, on March 7th, 1777, a male slave, Daniel Boone and Chief Blackfish. The raids assumed a new dimension with Blackfish led 200 or more Shawnee across the Ohio River and established a base camp near the crossing of the Licking River. From there he sent out small parties to do what damage they could. On March 7th, 1777, a male slave was killed and his master wounded as they worked in a field at Boonesboro. So Daniel Boone, they had slaves. Daniel Boone brought slaves in with him. That's why Kentucky maintained slavery for such a long time, because of Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone also was a Dunmore agent. He was proud to be a stooge of King George III. So, at the same time, some settlers who were making maple sugar were attacked near Harrodsburg. So, Blackfish is sending an invasion of Blackfish, 200 or more Shawnee across the Ohio River. Blackfish is going towards Boonesboro. He's attacking Harrodsburg. Hugh McGarry and the search party, to see why the sugar makers were late, found the mutilated body of his stepson. Later, when the Indians began to burn the cabins outside the stockade, McGarry was in the party that rushed outside to drive him off. When a warrior wearing the shirt of his stepson was killed, Hugh McGarry, insane with rage, hacked the body into bits and fed the pieces to his dogs. So Hugh McGarry was a complete fucking psychopath. He was absolutely out of his fucking mind. The guy's a stepson of his, so I guess he cared about his stepson. But compare this to Chief Logan and Logan's Lament. Chief Logan was basically an Uncle Tom. Chief Logan was a friend of the white man, Captain John Logan. Captain John Logan had all of his people wiped out. All of his people wiped out, which precipitated Dunbar's War. Basically a one-day war at the Battle of Point Pleasant. I don't even know why they call it a war. I guess there was troops and they did gather troops and shit. So I guess that's what makes it a war. But Logan told Simon Girty, and Simon Girty repeated, I appeal to any white man to say if he ever entered Logan's cabin hungry and Logan gave him not meat. If ever he came cold and naked, Logan would clothe the white man. He clothed him. During the course of the last long and bloody war, Logan remained idle in his cabin, an advocate for peace. Such was my love for the whites that my countrymen pointed as they passed, and they said, Logan is the friend of the white man. He's an Uncle Tom of the white man. He loves white people more than he even loves himself. I haven't thought to live with you, but for the injuries of one man, Colonel Cressup. Colonel Cressup. And some burn, Daniel Greathouse. Colonel Cressup, Daniel Greathouse. Daniel Greathouse was actually the worst motherfucker. Fuck Daniel Greathouse. His house ain't great, his house sucks. But for the injuries of Colonel Cressup and Daniel Greathouse last spring in cold blood and unprovoked murdered all the relations of Captain John Logan, Native American, not sparing even my women and children. There runs not one drop of my blood in the veins of any living creature. This has called on me for revenge, and I've sought it, and I've killed many. I have fully glutted my vengeance. For my country I rejoice at the beams of peace, but do not harbor a thought that mine is not the joy of fear. Logan never felt fear. He will not turn on his heel to save his life. Who is there to mourn for Logan? Not one. Not one. Logan's Lament. That's Captain John Logan, whose retaliation basically started Dunbar's War. Daniel Greathouse was the one who slaughtered his family, even though Colonel Cressup got the blame for it. So Hugh McGarry at the Battle of Blue Licks says, come on everybody, charge across the river. Follow me. Follow me, like 5 years ago when I chopped that one fucking Indian to pieces. That one fucking Native American into bits. And they all followed. Even Boone's like, fuck it, I'll follow, but we're all dead. And then Israel dies, So that group think. One person says, let's all fucking do it like a mob. They all just fucking run in. They just follow. The craziest fucking alpha male is the one that they follow. So, McGarry warned Boone and said, hey man, I fucked up. We need to get out of here. And even though he hadn't taken part in the battle, George Rogers Clark was blamed for it as a senior militia officer. He was widely condemned in Kentucky for allowing the British force to cross the river and the inflict the Blue Licks disaster. In response, Clark launched a retaliatory aid across the Ohio River in November 1782. His force consisted of more than 1,000 men, including Benjamin Logan and Daniel Boone. So Daniel Boone on the anti-Indian raid with Ben Logan and George Rogers Clark, saying he only killed one fucking Indian. Clotter and Harrison, you don't know what you're talking about. Daniel Boone killed more than just one Indian. The Kentuckians destroyed 5 unoccupied Shawnee villages on the Great Miami River, so they say. In the last major offensive of the American Revolution, no battles took place since the Shawnees refused to stand and fell back their villages on the Mad River. So